Thank you very much, Dan. In the world of environmental law, the career of Gus Speth is legendary. He was born in Orangeburg, South Carolina, went to Yale College, went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. After graduating from Yale Law School, he clerked for Justice Hugo Black. He then became, as you heard, one of the co-founders of NRDC, largely inspired by the work of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. NRDC quickly became, and as we all know, continues today, one of the leading public interest environmental law firms in the country. During the administration of President Jimmy Carter, Gus was the chairman of the President's Council on Environmental Quality. During that time, CEQ issued 4 reports calling for action on climate change. He has said that this experience broadened his horizons from just domestic environmental law to international issues. After President Reagan took office, he taught at Georgetown Law School, and then he founded the World Resources Institute, which has grown into one of the leading NGOs in Washington. He served as its president until 1993, when he became the administrator of the United Nations Development Program and chair of the UN Development Group. In 1999, he became the dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He retired from Yale in 2009 and became a professor at Vermont Law School, and he is co-chair of the Next System project. Gus is the author or editor of at least 7 books, 2 of which I've especially enjoyed: Red Sky at the Morning, America and the Crisis of Global Environmental Control from 2004, and The Bridge at the End of the World, Capitalism, the Environment, and Crossing from Crisis to Sustainability, published in 2008. He's received numerous awards and honorary degrees and is on many boards, but rather than take the time to list them all, you'd rather hear from him, so I'd like to present to you Gus Speth.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all come out on this nice night, and I really appreciate it. It's particularly wonderful to be here with members of the Sive family and his colleagues from the firm. That means a lot. And I think, Dan, thank you for and your firm for creating this opportunity. I'm really honored, and it's also a great pleasure to see some old friends here. I was told to keep it rather short, and I didn't do that one time at Yale, and I ran over badly, and I apologized, and one of the students stood up and said, "It's okay, Dean Speth, there's a calendar on the wall behind you." And so I have my watch tonight. All the groups that, and thank you, Michael, for inviting me and for that warm introduction. All the groups that Michael mentioned have done better after I left. I must begin with one of my favorite stories, and it's a story about David Sive. He's one of my heroes. And in the fall of 1968, I was riding the New Haven Railroad, some cars from which still exist on Metro North, into New York City, and reading the New York Times. And I read a story about the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the work that they were doing, and another story about some environmental issue. And it occurred to me, wow, why don't we establish an NAACP Legal Defense Fund type environmental group for the environment? And that was a little epiphany that I had, and we were worried about finding the money to support our group, and I was worried that we didn't, the word environment wasn't even used like it is now. And at Yale there were no environmental law courses, no case books, and Yale had very little to say in the field, and to the best of my knowledge, other law schools didn't either at that point. But I asked around, and I did get the name of one attorney who was said to practice environmental law, and that was David Sive. And so I beat a path to David Sive's door, and he welcomed me warmly. And he mentioned something in our conversation that turned out to be critical. He said to me, you know, recently someone was seated right where you are, who's been asked by the Ford Foundation to investigate exactly what you want to do in creating this public interest environmental law firm. And I said to David, well, can you put me in touch with this person? And he did. And that was how we made contact with the Ford Foundation. And eventually, that led to the founding grant of what became the Natural Resources Defense Council. The story of how we got from this ragtag group of young law students to the Ford Foundation grant 2 years later in 1970 is an interesting one, and it's well told by John Adams and Patricia Adams in their wonderful book, A Force for Nature, and I won't repeat it here. I'll just say this. David Sive was a critical path feature of this launch of NRDC, and as Michael said, was really the founding father of environmental law in our country. He was a leader in the field for decades. At NRDC, we asked David to be on the board at NRDC, and he did serve for 22 years admirably on the board. He was a gracious and gentle man, and I hope his children feel that way. And he was a quiet person in a way, very dignified. And but when he spoke, everyone listened and listened well. So let me go back and reflect on this period, this formative period. Environmentalism was rather radical in radicalizing, and if we were going to succeed. And we had to, as a measure that we ought to be paying attention to, the sense of planetary limits in this period was palpable. Limits to Growth appeared in 1972 and sold over 1 million copies. People saw a fundamental incompatibility between this drive for limitless growth and this increasingly small and limited planet. Leading scientists like Paul Ehrlich and Ann Ehrlich and John Holdren, the President's science advisor now, argued, and I quote, for an economy that was non-growing in terms of the size of the human population, the quantity of physical resources in use, and the impact on the biological environment. We were called upon in this period to abandon our materialistic and consumerist ways. Ehrlich and Holdren saw and argued that growth was no longer available as a palliative, and so we would need to move to a period of redistribution, both within countries and among countries, to deal with our problems. People saw that we needed to shorten the work week way back then in order to create employment for everybody, and to have government investment into areas that the economy was not serving. And none of this was possible, they saw, without a dramatic revitalization of democratic life. And digging deeper, ecologists Barry Commoner and others asked whether capitalism itself was compatible with ecological needs and imperatives. And in his 1971 bestseller, The Closing Circle, Commoner's answer was, no, they're not compatible. So I think today's environmentalists, given where we are, could benefit from going back to these ideas of the 60s and 70s and rediscovering the movement's more radical roots and stepping outside the system in order to change it. And that's really what I want to talk to you about tonight. There are better people to talk about what's going on in American environmental law today than I am, but I want to talk with you about stepping outside the system and trying to change it before it's too late. So I think we need to reboot American environmentalism and bring environmental law into that process. If our dreams of 1970 had succeeded, if we were on the right track, we wouldn't be thinking about rebooting environmentalism. But here we are, 46 years after that burst of energy and hope at the first Earth Day, headed towards the very planetary conditions that we sought at that time to set out to prevent. Internationally, there's been real progress under the Montreal Protocol in protecting the ozone layer, and some progress, serious progress in transboundary acid rain. And now this robust Montreal Protocol has been applied to curb emissions of HFCs, one of the most potent greenhouse gases. And that was a big step forward. But the fact is that the most threatening global trends that we highlighted, for example, in the Global 2000 report in the 1980s, have worsened. And global scale problems are now deeper and more urgent than they ever were. And it would be nice to think that after all these negotiations and treaties and meetings, that we had gotten to the point where we could really implement them. And that would deal with these problems. But the truth is that that's not the case. Despite all the negotiations and discussions, the international community has not laid the foundation that would allow for rapid and effective action on these great global scale issues. And the problem with these major treaties that we've negotiated is not weak enforcement or weak compliance, it's more fundamental, it's weak treaties. And typically these agreements are easy for governments to get around because the treaties' impressive but non-binding goals are not followed by clear requirements and enforceability and timetables. And when there are targets and timetables, as in the recent Paris Climate Accord, which I do applaud and feel very positive about, but these targets are often inadequate and enforcement is lacking. And that's true also of the Paris Accords. So the end result is that the Climate Convention is not protecting climate, the Biodiversity Convention is not protecting biodiversity, the Desertification Convention is not preventing desertification, and even the older and stronger Law of the Sea agreement is not protecting fisheries. So the bottom line is on the global scale issues, the problems have gone from bad to worse, and governments are not yet prepared to deal with them. You know, what has happened is, I think, that governments have been far more effective and devoted to representing the economic interest of their corporations than they have been to representing the environmental interest of their citizens. Here and more broadly, the findings of political analyst David Levy and Peter Newell, I think, are pertinent, and I quote, "Government negotiating positions in Europe and the US have tended to track the stances of the major industries active on key issues, and as such, the achievement of global accords is impossible if important economic sectors are unified in opposition." And there are many other problems, of course, with this international process that we've created. They rarely deal with the underlying systemic drivers that are causing these problems. We have created weak multilateral international agencies to deal with these issues, nothing comparable to the World Trade Organization, for example. We've persisted with consensus-based negotiating procedures, and we've not dealt with the real problems that a lot of these countries face and haven't really engaged them in a way that would allow them to have the space to come to agreement with us on these international treaties, with us. But the lion's share of the blame, I think, must be the rich countries who had the power to, and still do, to do things that need doing, and especially the United States, which has been a principal foot dragger in these negotiations often, and in the creation, for example, of a World Environment Organization. So if that's the unfortunate track record at the global level, what can we say about our domestic issues? Well, we can say that the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act have done a lot to clean up air and water in our country. What's distressing, though, is that despite some of the toughest pollution control laws, certainly of the 70s, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, we still have huge problems in air and water. In 1972, I remember that Senator Muskie and others wrote into the Clean Water Act that by 1983, the waters of the United States were supposed to be fishable and swimmable, all of them. Well, the EPA reports now with some regularity that about half the waters in the United States are not fishable and swimmable, and about half of the estuaries are not in good health, and 2/3 of them are impaired for fishing. And on the air quality front, the Lung Association reports that 1/3 of all Americans live in counties that are exposed to unhealthful levels of air pollution, particularly on the East Coast and in California. But the real bigger problem, I think, is that outside this area of air and water pollution control, our efforts have been dramatically less successful. U.S. energy consumption since the first Earth Day has climbed by 40%. CO2 emissions have gone up by about 30%. We still depend on fossil fuels today for over 80% of our energy. I think our government's failure to deal with the crisis of climate change is the greatest dereliction of civic responsibility in the history of the Republic. And we will all suffer, and our children will suffer from that dereliction of responsibility. We've lost a lot of good land. Americans have protected an area the size of California in terms of protected wilderness. But at the same time, we've basically paved over and developed and otherwise closed an area of open space the size of Florida. We're losing about 100,000 acres of wetlands a year, despite the pledge of no net loss of wetlands. We have a rich wildlife heritage, but right now, 40% of the fish species are threatened with extinction, 30% of the flowering plants, and between 10 and 20% of mammals and reptiles and amphibians. And that doesn't really take into account what climate change could do. So we also continue to be exposed to a chemical cocktail. 5 to 6 billion pounds of insecticides and herbicides and other biocides are released into the environment globally each year, and 1/4 of that amount is released or sold released in the United States or sold by the United States. It's been estimated that less than 1/10 of 1% of these billions of pounds actually reaches a pest. EPA's toxics release inventory reports that some 4 billion pounds of chemicals are disposed in the environment now, as opposed to being treated or recycled. And 1/3 of this amount was released into surrounding air or waterways. So here's the bottom line, in a way. The Columbia-Yale Environmental Performance Index recently put the U.S. 43rd ranking countries, put the U.S. 43rd in terms of air quality work, 84th in terms of fisheries, 90th in terms of biodiversity, and 44th in climate and energy performance. Surprising even to me. So there are a lot of overarching critiques of environmental law that have emerged as a result. One of the most trenchant is Mim Wood's book, Nature's Trust, which I commend to you. Our friend, political scientist Richard Andrews, Pete Andrews, noted that a while back that U.S. environmental programs were never designed to deal with the underlying causes that were driving environmental decline, and by and large they failed to do so, he said, not surprisingly. So all we really have to do to destroy the planet's climate, to impoverish the biota, to toxify our people, is just to keep doing exactly what we're doing today. With no growth in human population, no growth in the world economy, just keep releasing greenhouse gases at current rates, continue to degrade ecosystems and release toxic chemicals at current rates, and our world in the latter part of this century will hardly be fit to live in. But of course, human activities aren't about to hold at current levels. This is always gripping figure to be. It took all of history to grow the $7 trillion world economy that we had when I was 8 in 1950. And now we grow a world economy more than that much, usually, every decade. So from all of history to a decade. So the potential for huge environmental losses in the future is really there. It's omnipresent. So we tried hard, right, over these past several decades to address these issues globally, nationally, and a great experiment as a result has been conducted. And I think the evidence is in. The approaches we've been trying for the past several decades, 4 decades, haven't worked very well. Haven't worked very well at all. We've won all these victories. We count them up and we publicize them, but we're on the cusp of losing the planet. So I think it's important to ask, something is terribly wrong. More of the same can't be the answer. We've had the growth and the strength and the numbers and the funding of our environmental efforts and our environmental organizations over many decades now, and it hasn't done the job that we need doing. So I think American environmentalists, myself included, have to take some responsibility for this result. And I'll return to that in just a moment. But what I want to say is that our part of the blame is decidedly the lesser part, let me tell you. As Frederick Bell has written, very quickly, a strong and enormously successful anti-environmental disinformation industry sprang up. It was so successful, he writes, that it helped to midwife a new phase in environmental history, environmental politics, one in which an abundance of environmental concern was nearly blocked by an equal abundance of anti-environmental contestation. And of course, nowhere has this disinformation effort been more successful, unfortunately, than with climate change. And all of which was brilliantly chronicled not long ago by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway in their book, Merchants of Doubt. This disinformation effort was really part of a larger picture of reaction. It might be dated from Lewis Powell's famous 1971 memorandum to the Chamber of Commerce, where he urged the Chamber to urge their members and to urge corporations in the U.S. to get active in politics and to get active in the regulatory process and push back as hard as they could. Well, we've seen a huge effort in that regard. And especially since Reagan was elected in 1980, every step has been hard fought. There have been some gains, but there have been a lot of losses too. The conservative assault on environmental protection has been told really well, I think, in Judith Lazer's 2012 book, Open for Business. She was at MIT. Since the 1970s, she writes, conservative activists have disseminated a compelling anti-regulatory storyline to counter the environmental narrative. They've mobilized grassroots opposition to environmental regulation and undertaken sophisticated legal challenges. This anti-regulatory rhetoric emphasizes distrust of the federal bureaucracy. Oh, you heard that? Admiration for unfettered private property rights, worship of markets, a skepticism about science, and disdain for people like me, environmental advocates. And by employing this formula, she writes, conservatives have been instrumental in blocking efforts to pass major new environmental legislation and increasing the stringency of existing laws. So this constantly building opposition over the years is, to my way of thinking, the obvious immediate reason for this environmental failure that I have related. But this exercise of power and control over what's going on, as I will discuss in a minute, is, I think, merely the surface manifestation of deeper systemic imperatives. But before turning to these deeper imperatives, I want to return to where I think we made a mistake, a big one. As these federal laws burst onto the scene in the early 70s, we pursued the avenues that they opened up. Our path to doing something concrete, to being successful, was opened up by all of the laws, including the National Environmental Policy Act and others. And in going down this path, we tended to leave by the wayside the thoughts and the ideas and the admonitions of people like Paul Ehrlich and Barry Commoner and Donella Meadows, which I mentioned earlier. Their point back then was that we should be looking at the deep causes of environmental deterioration, and they knew then that we had to seek fundamental changes in the prevailing system of political economy if we wanted to succeed. We had to proceed down the path of system change. They saw that the problem was the system that we were working in and made a lot of proposals for changing it. Well, we ignored them, largely. And we should have revisited these issues when we began to hit the wall with the Reagan administration. But what happened instead was that our very successes in the 1970s tended to lock in place an approach. We grew more and more inside the Beltway, and inside the system, in effect, we were compelled, I think, to a certain tameness by the need to succeed in Washington. And as Washington got more conservative, environmentalists, I think, became more cautious. And so what I did, was opted to work within the system of political economy that we found at the time and neglected to seek transformation and transformational changes in that system itself. So I think today's environmentalism is very good as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough, nearly. The problem has been the absence of a huge complementary investment of time, energy, and money in deeper approaches to change. Here's what I'm really driving at this evening. System change, I think, is essential because our environmental problems are actually rooted in defining features of the current political economy. Environmental problems are rooted in defining features of what we have today, of the political economy today. And here they are. Here are these features. An unquestioning society-wide commitment to economic growth at virtually any cost. A measure of growth, GDP, that includes not only good but bad and ugly. Powerful corporate interests whose overriding objective is to generate profit and to grow, including profit from avoiding the social and environmental costs that they create. Markets that systematically fail to recognize those costs unless required to do so by government, and government that's subservient to the corporate interest and the growth imperative, so it doesn't get done. And the rampant consumerism that many of us, myself included sometimes, are guilty of and spurred endlessly on in that regard by very sophisticated advertising. Social and economic insecurity, so vast that it often paralyzes action and makes everyone scared about the future, their economic future, and charges of loss of jobs or hurt the economy resonate very powerfully with people who are vulnerable and on the margins. And lastly, this economy is now a full world economy. We've grown to the point that we're having effects on the basic biophysical operations of the planet. So all of this combines to deliver a system that's not good at all at sustaining human and natural communities. Those really are not, the people, the places, and the planet are not really priorities of this system. Something different. I think we need a new environmentalism. And the core of this new environmentalism is that it really seeks a different kind of economy. It seeks to escape from the system I've just described and move to the next system. And to deliver on this promise of a next system, clearly we need a new politics, right? Yeah. So I think it's time to go back and ask the question that we asked in the 60s. what is an environmental issue? Well, certainly it includes environmental problems that we all are acutely aware of. But what if part of that answer to what is an environmental issue is that an environmental issue includes anything that really has a significant effect on determining environmental outcomes, right? An environmental issue is things that really affect our possibilities for progress. Well, if you take that definition, then surely this creeping plutocracy and corporatocracy that we see in the country, the ascendancy of money power and corporate power over people power, well, that's an environmental issue. And more, the chartering and empowering of artificial persons to do virtually anything in the name of profit and growth. Well, the very nature of today's corporation, that's an environmental issue. The fetish of GDP growth as the ultimate public good and perhaps the main aim of government. It's about all our politicians can talk about and have some agreement on. Our runaway consumerism, our vast social insecurity with half the U.S. families living paycheck to paycheck. Well, these are the underlying drivers of environmental loss. And in my view, they are environmental issues. They're imperative environmental issues, but rarely do they appear on the agendas of our national environmental organizations. So I think the agenda of a new environmentalism should embrace the profound challenge to consumerism and commercialism and the lifestyles they offer, a turning away from growth mania and from a profit-centered and profit-motivated economy, a redefinition of what society should be striving to grow with new indicators, a challenge to corporate dominance and the transformation of the corporation over time and its goals, a commitment to deep change in both the reach of the market, pushing back on commodification, reasserting the commons, a challenge to how productive assets are owned, and a far more democratic thumb on investment decisions, where we're pursuing democratically determined priorities with our investment decisions and not just bank-determined and company-determined priorities, and a powerful assault on the dominant values that we have of our materialism, our anthropocentric values, our contempocentric values. So I think environmentalists have got to join with other social progressives in addressing the crisis of inequality and deprivation in our country. We've got to join with those seeking political reform and trying to strengthen and reclaim our democracy. We should be working with a progressive coalition to build a mighty force in electoral politics. Look at what the Tea Party did when they got interested in politics and started electing people. It's not been part, really, of the environmental strength. We certainly need a new way of reaching out to people, a new ability to speak to the aspirations of American people and American families. And since I've been in this business, the discourse has been dominated by lawyers and economists and scientists, and we really need to hear a lot more from the poets and the prophets and the philosophers and the psychologists and the psychiatrists. So I think this new politics has got to be broadly inclusive. It's got to reach out to working families and black communities and people of color, frontline communities, religious organizations, the women's movement, and other movements of complementary interest and shared fate. Much stronger alliances are needed to overcome this silo effect where all the progressives are pretty much in their own silos, so it's coming, is changing. So I think the final goal of this new politics has got to be to build a movement, a real movement. We talk about an environmental movement, that's a little stale. We need a real one of people, all the progressives network together, protesting, demanding action, demanding accountability from governments, accountability from corporations, and taking steps individually and in our own communities to realize sustainability and justice in everyday life. Well, can we see the beginnings of such a movement? I don't know. We can dream about such a movement after this election. We can dream about the Bernie forces and the Elizabeth Warren forces coming together and the Black Lives Matter and Native Americans hit Standing Rock coming. It might happen. Let's hope that post the 2016 election this happens. So whether we are driven by climate and fossil fuel insults, by poverty and low wages and joblessness, by deportation of immigrants and other family issues, by the treatment of women, of voter suppression, people are rising up and challenging key aspects of the system. And they're seeking to drive deep change beyond incremental reform. And we're offering alternative visions and new paths forward. There are groups that are marching and demonstrating. Others are starting to run people for public office on alternative agendas. There are places where the needed research is occurring, and that's where I'm working. New coalitions are bringing diverse groups together, like the New Economy Coalition. It now has 140-something members, big groups and little groups across the country. And indeed, if we look abroad, we see examples of things happening that we should be learning from here. So I think there are grounds for hope and reasons to believe that real change is possible. And I hope today's young people won't worry about being thought to be radical or out in left field. I think we have the example of Pope Francis. We have the examples of socialist Bernie Sanders and other things that, so I hope the young people today will short-circuit the long and tortuous learning process that I took. And if it seems right to you, young people, embrace it. There are wonderful people out there in the world now that are building new communities in which you can participate. Thank you all very much, and thank you, David Sive. Well, that wasn't much about environmental law, but it was what I hope environmental law will reach out to embrace.